we are Team Buckbeak. I'm Merritt Schroeder.
I'm Blaine Palazzo.
I'm Emma Corona. I'm Hannah McClain. Taylor Wiley.
And we were studying how defensive reactions and rectifying behaviors influence public perceptions of organizations.
As an introduction, the purpose of the study is to examine the effect of different types of crisis response on attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors. This is of interest simply because the best practices for crisis response could be adapted based on the information obtained from this experiment. Organizations can use this information to generate and increase a favorable perception of themselves from both the stakeholders and the public's perceptions. The framework of the study is rooted in the idea that post-crisis communication can repair a reputation or prevent reputational damage if handled correctly. And our overall hypothesis was that publics will have more positive perception of organizations that use rectifying behavior responses rather than organizations that use defensive responses.
In gathering our research beforehand, looking at some other people's theories, we looked at the situational communication theory by Coombs and a lot of other people looked at. Basically what that one is just that the choosing a crisis response depends heavily on the given situation. We also referred to the Smith Strategic Planning for Public Relations for our definitions of all the different crisis responses. For that one, for defensive response, is obviously reacting in a way that they defend themselves, but in a less aggressive way than like offensive or some of the other ones, through either denial, excuse, or justification. For rectifying behavior, that's responding to criticism in more of a positive manner, trying to do so through either repentance, restitution, or corrective action. And then also Coombs, in some of his studies, talked about perception as well. He talked about the 3 objectives to responding to a crisis, one of which was changing the perception of the organization throughout the crisis. Coombs talked about in a lot of his studies what he called rebuild strategies, which is what we're referring to when we talk about rectifying behavior. They were essentially the same thing, and he had one overall idea that they were typically the best for reducing a negative effect on the organization throughout the crisis. We also looked at 2 other studies. We looked at a couple, but these were the 2 that we gathered a lot of information from. The Cooley and Cooley one went into good detail about how GM responded when they were struggling through a bankruptcy crisis. And what they gathered from that was that using justification heavily throughout theirs really helped them. And that was a part of one of our responses as well. We also looked at the Lee and Larissy response. And while they had different opinions from us, they heavily relied on the denial response. That one reinforced the SCCT theory that within a given situation, different responses can be the best option.
Okay, so for our study, we decided to run an experiment to evaluate participants' responses to the 8 different crisis response strategies, and we used a within subjects design. Again, our hypothesis was that publics would have a more positive perception toward an organization that used rectifying behavior responses rather than defensive responses. So for our participants, we needed 23 participants who were 18 and older, and we were able to get 28 full participants. They were recruited from a link that we posted to our social media accounts to Qualtrics. And so the majority were females. We had 71% female, mostly Caucasian, and the average age was 18 to 25. For our stimuli, we had 25 stimuli in the form of pictures that we were able to grab from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we had questions about attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors, and we asked the same questions for each stimuli. Our independent variables were our 8 themes of the crisis communication responses, and our dependent variables were the attitude, perception, and behavioral questions.
Okay, so once we had collected the data, the first thing that we did was run a factor analysis on the 4 perception questions. We just chose like the first variable, and we found that all of the items loaded together, and which means that we didn't have to eliminate any of the questions, and that they were all applicable. And so the next step was for rectifying behaviors and for defensive responses. There were 4 different stimuli for each one. And so we took the 4 perception questions for each one of those and combined them all into one variable. So then all the 16 questions were together into one. We also ran a reliability test, and we found that our alpha value was 0.859, and to be considered reliable, it needs to be over 0.75. So we saw that the questions, the scale was reliable. And so once we had the variables combined into the two, rectifying behavior and defensive responses, we ran a paired samples t-test, and through that, it just compared the data between the two, and we found the results. Here are the mean for defensive response was, we had like 102, which it took the totals of all of the responses from the 1 to 5 like scale questions for the perception questions. And so we have the total of defensive response. The mean is 102 for rectifying behavior, 111, and so our data was statistically significant. And so we can use these numbers to show that people responded more favorably in terms of their perception of the organization when the organization used rectifying behavior versus whenever the organization used defensive response.
Alright, so to summarize, our research was guided by the hypothesis that people would favor an organization that used rectifying behavior rather than a defensive response. The study that we followed confirmed the research as well as our results that rectifying behavior was more favorable and had the better perception. We used a simple t-test that showed the results that Hannah explained, and it's more likely because the public would rather an organization that responds better to corrections rather than repeatedly having the actions occur that originally started the problem. So our experiment adds to research because using an experiment, the simple t-test, it creates a cause and effect. So basically whatever response strategy is used has a direct effect on public's perception. The experiments are easy to replicate as well. Future researchers can add to it to further support it or refute our hypothesis. Some of our limitations, participants complained that the experiment was too long. Some also complained that the screenshots, the stimuli we used, didn't exactly correlate with the definitions of the response strategies we used. So part of that is because our sample consisted of self-selecting groups, which means people who just happened to stumble upon our survey, questionnaire, through our social media sites rather than professionals who were knowledgeable or interested in the subject matter. So that created confusion, and also if people weren't interested, they were more likely to click through and kind of get through it if they didn't understand what was going on. For future directions, we would advise to condense the questions and direct and define terms to make the experiment more concise and easier for anyone to understand. Maybe to edit examples so that people aren't relying on sole definitions and whatnot.
Does anybody have any questions?